We moved the antenna to the microphone up here, so we hopefully don't get the same static that we get from time to time. So, if you have your Bibles with you, please turn to the book of Acts, and we'll pick up in chapter 18 as Paul arrives in Corinth. Raise your hand if you need some discouragement today. Timothy, I got you covered. No. I believe Paul hit a slump in this passage, and I believe it was a time where he really needed encouragement, and he had some, well, we'll get into it. He had some events that would have caused anyone to be discouraged, but God met him there, and God encouraged him in a variety of ways. And I hope you're encouraged today as you read and see where God might encourage you today. And I hope he does. Verse 1, after this, Paul left Athens and he went to Corinth. He found there a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife, Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, and he went to see them. And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked. For they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and he tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. Father, I lift up our time today knowing that you have a word for each of us, and we find ourselves always looking at the characters that we're reading about and trying to place ourselves in their shoes. Because often we are. And sometimes we find ourselves in a situation that we can't exactly know what's going to happen next, but we're hoping for something to change. And Lord, I believe Paul at this time needed some friends. And Lord, he met people that you put in his life for a reason. And he had no way that he was going to meet these people before he came. But he found himself in a place that needed the gospel probably more than anywhere, Lord. And I just ask that you would help us to see where we might be in a similar place. Lord, in our town that needs the gospel. Lord, equip us and encourage us as you did Paul during this time. In Jesus' name. Amen. The reason why I believe he was discouraged at this point, if you look at the first missionary journey that Paul had, it was eventful, but it was encouraging. There was just miracle after miracle, event where people were getting saved. He was going into uncharted territory, and he was with friends. He had companions in ministry with him. This second leg of the journey, the second journey, was not as, well, it was one with, I would say, more trial. Remember his friend Barnabas that he was in ministry with so long, they got into such a sharp disagreement, they ended their friendship before this. Now, how'd you like to go on any mission trip immediately after ending a friendship? That's not a good way to start. Then you have an encouraging event and a discouraging event. You have getting in jail, you have getting out of jail. You have family getting saved, and then you go into this place called Athens, which is full of intellectuals, and you're just enamored with how full of idolatry it was. And so Paul, being a really smart man, put together a very good case for the unknown God. And he got to present before people that were pretty amazing, but it didn't have much fruit. So now he leaves to Corinth, and he's alone. How many of you like doing anything alone, especially ministry? It's not the same. There's a reason why God sent 2 by 2. There's a reason why he paired the apostles, because you need each other. Friendships are important. They're not optional. They are important. So Paul was here in Corinth, and if you know the story how Corinth was a deeply wicked place. had a reputation for being so evil. Not evil in the way that we would say, where you would think of like Sodom and Gomorrah with lots of violence and all that, but similar on the sexual front. Very corrupted. So Paul was surrounded by this. He was already disturbed with the idolatry of Athens, and now that he came to Corinth, I think he needed a new event. It was a remarkable place. I read that it was, in classical Greek, the phrase to act like a Corinthian meant to practice in fornication, and a Corinthian companion meant a prostitute. So this is what he was surrounded with. What an opportunity for the gospel, though. This is a place where most church people would probably not go. This would be the town that most missionaries would just skip over. Not Paul. So I guess what shined to me was in verse 2, when Paul arrived into Corinth, it said that he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus. Now, do you think that was an accident? Right. This was on purpose. This was a meant-to-be relationship. Now, put yourselves in Aquila and Priscilla's shoes for a minute. They had to leave their home. They had just recently arrived into Corinth because the emperor had said all the Christians need to get out. All the Jews need to get out of Rome. So now they're in a place that they're discouraged. They're alone. They don't have their long-standing friends with them. They don't have their extended family for their support. They're now in a strange place, and as a Jew, you would have some morals at least, and this would also be an equally awkward place. And God decided to bring these three people together and form a friendship. I love that. God knows when to bring people into your life. He had some new friends here. They were also foreigners, and they would actually prove to be lifelong friends. In Romans chapter 16, Paul later says that these are fellow workers who risked their very necks. How'd you like to be called a fellow worker with Paul? How'd you like to have Paul say that you risked your neck for the gospel? It's a pretty good reputation. Here's the thing. You never know who you're going to meet in this life. We get so used to things, but it's like a river. You never really know where life is going to take you. You never know who you're going to meet. And for especially these people, for this couple, you never know who you're going to leave as well. So these people that were now isolated, alone, on the run, unsure of life, well, God said, yeah, you guys would make some good friends. I'm going to stick you all together. So he does that. Interestingly, they have the same trade. They're both tent makers or leather workers. Does anybody here work with leather ever? One guy. Thank you. Josh, we'd like to look to you to make some leather stuff later on. That was all a pitch. No. I have a friend in South Africa that used to spend a lot of time on leather, and it's an interesting trade. Like, you actually have to put some effort into learning how it works. You could say it's simple, but there's a lot of stuff that you can learn along the way. But the tools to do such is you could fit in a bag. You have some snippers and some awls and some, you have some various tools, but they can all fit in your backpack, and you can really travel anywhere if you're good with leather, if you understand what it is. So Paul found himself now working alongside, wouldn't you know it, two other people. They were Jews, and they had a lot in common, and they got to work together. I personally find this really neat, that God put together co-workers in a job place, and there was a ministry opportunity between them. Don't underestimate your opportunity in the workplace to minister. And I know there's a lot of retirees here, but don't underestimate the people that you don't think God put you in your life to minister to. You would think, well, that's my work relationship, and this is my church relationship, and these are my family members. God blends that a lot of times. And so just, a little in common and a relationship is built. Why do you think God put these people together at the time? I think they needed it. A new friendship. can kindle something in your heart that would encourage you if you're feeling down. And also, just as a reminder, friendships can prove to be the most meaningful events in life. Spouses and family are okay too, right? But it's true, isn't it? Some of the deep friendships that you've collected over the years, haven't they meant the most to you of all the things in life? I mean, there's been, if you've never had a true friend, you've missed out on life. Having true and good and meaningful, that's the I got it, meaningful, underlined a bunch of times here, meaningful friendships is just so valuable. I would encourage you to also do the same. Develop meaningful relationships with your fellow believers for mutual encouragement, accountability, and collaboration in ministry. Nothing better than a team of friends that want to minister the gospel. So Paul did that. It says that on the Sabbath he was reasoning from the Scriptures. Indicates a rational and logical presentation of the gospel message, Leon Morris said. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and all the way to verse 16, you don't have to put it up on the screen or anything, but one of the things that Paul said was, when I came preaching into Corinth, I came knowing nothing but Christ and Him crucified. He had just left a place that was full of academia, all kinds of philosophy. The rational thought was the what everybody hungered for. Whoever was smarter and had the more interesting idea was who they wanted to hear. Paul came and he met them with the brilliance, but it wasn't as effective as just coming with the simple gospel. And so Paul, when he came into Corinth, later on it says that he came in fear and trembling. He did not come with this. That's also one of the reasons why I think he's discouraged, right? When you're feeling victorious and courageous, you're not exactly fear and trembling, right? They're opposed to each other. And it said that when he came with humility, and the reason why is because God's power was made strong in his weakness. So if you're feeling weak today, if you're feeling shaky, and if you're feeling out of place and you feel alone, guess what? God has a ministry for you. God could use you in that spot and in that way to minister to other people and show His power in your weakness. But Paul pointed to Jesus. That was his message every Sabbath. Now, just as a practical example, how did he manage this? How was he able to balance his, what we call, this is where we got the name, by the way, for tent making, right? So he was a minister, but if you notice here that he wasn't able to devote all of his time to preaching like he was in the other cities. In Philippi and Berea, it said that he would go into the marketplace every day and reason with whoever just happened to be there, which is a really cool way to word it because it shows that it's an uninvited gospel. He would take the gospel to where people were unsuspecting. They had no idea that when they were buying eggs, they were going to hear about Jesus. That's the way Paul liked it. But Paul had to work. He had to support himself during this time. He didn't have the type of support that would have came prior. So now he needed to support himself. And I love what he did. Notice how he worked during the week, and then on the Sabbath was when he had time to really minister to the people. You see, there's a balance there. So he did a good job at his work, but then he also had a priority to preach the gospel every Sabbath. He never missed it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 11, when he later wrote this church, he said, if we've sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? That's a logical answer. If others have this rightful claim on you, do we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. You see, if Paul needed to be supported in this place at this time, it would have been an obstacle. It would not have been able to serve that brand new fledgling church well to have him say, I can't work for a living. I have to preach every day. This wouldn't have worked out. You see, Paul was willing to put the gospel first, which means that he had to work during the week to manage it. It's very practical advice. Do you not know that all those who are employed at the temple service get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Very plain, but it wasn't possible at first. Now, verse 5, I got a question for you. What's better than new friends? Old friends. See? So he was discouraged. God gave him new friendships. He gave him a work. He gave him a ministry. He's really functional at this time. He's got a nice balance in life. But you know what's even better? Old friends coming in. And that's exactly what happens in verse 5. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, the ESV says, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. So now you got to put yourself in his shoes for a minute. And it's not a stretch to imagine here that it wouldn't have been an encouraging thing to have these two guys join Paul now at this time. Wouldn't it have been an exciting? Now you got new friends, you got a healthy life, and now your old friends are there for your, I would say, comfort. And they brought good news, and we know also from 1 Thessalonians, verse 1 of chapter 3, therefore when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, our brother, and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in the faith, that no one be moved by these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we are destined for this. When we were with you, we kept telling you beforehand that we were to suffer affliction, just as it has come to pass, and just as you know. For this reason, when we could bear it no longer, I sent to learn about your faith, for fear that somehow the tempter had tempted you, and our labor would be in vain. So he wanted the report. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 8, we see that Paul says here, I robbed other churches. Now that's an interesting phrase. By accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. You know who he's talking about? Paul and Silas. These guys came and they brought the relief that was a support from another church so that he could spend his time ministering to these Corinthians. And it encouraged him and it strengthened him and it gave him the free time. Look at the second half of verse 5. When they came, it said that he became fully devoted. So now he's able to spend all of his time because he was able to be supported by another missionary church. Isn't that great? Isn't that very practical? So this is what happened. He did it in order to serve you. Now the Corinthians had forgotten about this, and they later on had people come in that were trying to basically fleece the church. That was their only interest, was to take money from them so that they could become wealthy at the expense of their livelihoods, really. And they were bringing with it a bunch of false teaching to boot. And so Paul wanted to remind them, when I came, I didn't come to you in the way that these false preachers are coming, trying to get all your money. I was a worker. I don't know if you know this, the pastors here, we all work for a living, right? You have good intention here. You don't have pastors that want to take the money and run. Paul was dealing with these Corinthians that they were susceptible to fall. By the way, I don't know if you send any money to anybody on TV, but I would discourage it. I don't see many ministries on TV, and I don't have this in my notes, that are worth a hill of beans. Let me put it that way, and I'm putting it real lightly. Whenever I go over my grandmother-in-law's house, it's everything I can do to just bear with what's on TV. It's always another telethon. It's always another thing. We need another $8 million for the thing. And it gets to me. It really irks at me because I see it flies in the face with the difference here between what Apostle Paul was like in his ministry. Of course, he made sure that providing for the ministry was just part of how the church is supposed to operate. But he also said if a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. right? So the principle is there that the person who ministers in the gospel should be willing to do whatever it takes to get the gospel paramount. And if that means working 6 days a week so that you can preach to a church free of charge, you should absolutely be willing to do that. But it's not optimal. If the church could provide for it, it's even better, because then he gets all of his time to invest in the gospel. So things are going good for the Corinthians at this time, especially for Paul. And what do you know always happens whenever things are going good? Opposition. As soon as things get going good, Satan takes notice and wants to put in some fiery darts. Verse 6 of Acts 18. When they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads, for I am innocent. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." And he left there, went to a house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. So now he's uplifted with new friends, and he's now comforted with the old friends. He's fully supplied in his ministry, and he's given everything he has to these Jews who are now reviling him and not willing to hear what he has to say. And they're giving him a bad name, and so he has had enough of this. I love that it said that he's occupied, so he was filling his time to do this, but it still brought opposing, reviled. Also, if you have King James or many other translations, they have the word here, blasphemed, and I think that's more accurate. I think the ESV missed it here. It's an indirect declaration of the deity of Jesus, because you cannot blaspheme a mere man, right? So they're blaspheming Jesus here. He shook out his garments. He basically said this: I am sick of you people. I don't even want the dust on my shoe from your synagogue, right? He's finished. He's had enough. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 6, Jesus said, "Do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn and attack you." That's a really strong statement from Jesus. And I have a question. How do you know when? When do you stop? When is enough? How do you know when you're being trampled on and you say, "I'm not going to give you any more of these pearls, because everything I give to you just gets stomped on and you use it to attack me in the end"? I don't know if this will answer, but I think it's implied here. You'll know. You'll know, right? There's a time where God directs your heart to say, "Okay, I've had enough. I'm done trying to minister to this person, because there is no evidence of anything I've ever said getting through. They only use it to attack me further." I know it's a very precise answer. Here's what I would say. Preach until you're innocent. That's what Paul did. Preach until the point where you know, I stand by everything I ever said to that person, and if I left now, there's nothing that I left unsaid. I've said it all. They're accountable for that, because God pays attention to every word you say, but he also pays attention to every word you hear. And so Paul was innocent at this point, and he packed his bags, and he got ready for the long journey, and he trekked next door. Said that he goes to the house next door to the synagogue. Can you imagine making that kind of a scene? "I have had enough of you people. I am finished with all of you. I am going right here. I'll be over here with someone who's going to listen." Now, I just find that hilarious. Sometimes, I think this is important, when you will need to take a stand where you're really not even going to leave afterwards. And you have to be willing to deal with the consequences of you taking that stand and still being in very close proximity to the people that you just let them know. Trey used to work for a company, you may have heard of it, it's called Macy's. And she was doing, this was 2020, we were trying to figure out what to do with our time, and so she picked up a part-time job at Macy's taking calls. Not selling stuff, calling out, but inbound calls for customer service. which is better, but it still was kind of stressful because you'd have these people that would be spending, $1,000 on a flip-flop or something, and they would call to complain about didn't get there in, one day or something. So she was dealing with a lot of that, and one of the things it's based in New York, and the company was, now we would put the term on there, woke. Right? It was just as woke as you could imagine. Every meeting was just full of what you would imagine it would be. And so there was a meeting one time that was about inclusivity and pronoun use and what's acceptable to not hurt other people's feelings and such. And so she sat through the whole thing, and one of the things that came up was an opportunity to say, is there anything that hurts you or offends you? So Trey took the opportunity. She said, a lot of times it really hurts me when people use my Lord's name in vain as a cuss word during these company meetings. Because they had they wouldn't hesitate during an official company meeting to just rattle off a bunch of cuss words, especially in Jesus. And she mentioned it, and the guy it was like the first time he'd ever heard of such a thing. What? You find that offensive? Yes, deeply offensive. It hurts me to the core. And so they wrote it into company policy. Right under pronoun use and all that, Macy's employees are not allowed to use the name of Jesus in a disparaging way. It's written into company policy because Trey voiced her opinion on one of these meetings. How cool is that? So that must have been why she was there. She didn't last much longer after that. But it's in their documentation. I think that's neat, but you never know what's going to happen until you make the stand. And sometimes you're still going to need to stay there after you make the stand. And that's kind of how I visualize what Paul was going through here now that he had moved out to this guy, Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Verse 8, Crispus, a ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. So Paul marched out and did his stand, and look what happened. Crispus was one of the few in Corinth who Paul actually personally baptized. We read in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 14. Here's another application. Seek to build relationships with people that God has put you in their life, and they're in your life to minister together. It is important. You never know what's going to come of it. They're there to encourage you and challenge you and assist you in your spiritual journey. You have another of this phrase, and I've just noticed it every time now. His entire household believed, and many Corinthians also believed. Now, we go into God's timely encouragement to Paul. Verse 9, the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, and I want everyone to really hear this phrase. Do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you. Can you imagine any more encouraging words than that from Jesus to Paul? Don't be afraid. I'm with you. Keep doing what you're supposed to be doing. I'm with you. No one will attack you to harm you, for I have many people, many in this city who are my people. Does anybody have an idea on why Jesus felt the need to tell Paul, do not be afraid? He was afraid, right? He doesn't waste his words. Paul was afraid. Isn't that interesting to know that Paul, of all people in the world, got afraid? It kind of sounded like things were already going good. Well, it just shows you don't trust your emotions. Your emotions will lie to you when things might actually be going good. They'll tell you that they're not. They'll tell you you're alone, and they'll tell you that God's not with you and you're in danger and you should be doubting everything. And those are the times that I feel in my life, and I know it's in yours too, God seems to meet me there. And that's exactly what he does with Paul. He meets with him and he says, do not be afraid. Go on being, do not be silent. Go on speaking. Paul was dealing with the culture shock in Athens and now this moral shock in Corinth. And it must have bothered him. I read a quote from a guy named Hughes that says, Corinth is sweat and perfume and grit smothered Paul's righteous soul. And he became depressed. I thought, well, that's pretty graphic. Spurgeon considered this part 3 points. Here's a 3-point sermon for you on this one. For I am with you. Spurgeon pointed out the presence of Jesus, the sympathy of Jesus, and the cooperation of Jesus. There's something encouraging about knowing God is near you, but it's also very encouraging to know that he's for you. He's on your side. So far as you're following his will, he is all about protecting you. He's all about encouraging you and fueling you. He will bring anyone in your life that needs to be there, that will be a help to you. He's got your back. And Paul needed to be reminded of this. And this isn't the first time that this happened. I'll read a few very quickly. In Acts chapter 23, when verse 10, it's always on time with God. When the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid of Paul to be torn in pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. That following night, the Lord stood by him, and he said, take courage. For as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you also must testify in Rome. Here he was going to get ripped apart that day. That's the time Jesus stood by him and encouraged him. Take courage. Chapter 27, verse 22. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. He's on a ship. The ship's going down. Everybody's afraid. Everyone's throwing everything overboard. And he's saying this, for this very night there stood before me an angel of God who became from whom I belong and I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul, for you must stand before Caesar. I'm not finished with you yet. I have somewhere you have to be, which is kind of a cheap reason to say you're going to live, but that's good enough, right? That works. At least I have a reason to be somewhere, so I know I'm going to have to live there. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has also granted to you all those who sail with you. Another passage, I was thinking of this one today, when John's sermon. This is in Ezekiel. Whether they hear or refuse to hear, for they are a rebellious house, they will know that a prophet has been among them. And you, son of man, do not be afraid of them, nor be afraid of their words, though briars and thorns are with you, and you sit on scorpions. Boy, that's a picture. Be not afraid of their words, nor be dismayed at their looks. I think the Message translation said, don't be afraid of their faces, for they are a rebellious house. He's saying, don't back down. This is what you need to expect, and I want you to have courage when you're doing it. I don't want you to pull back and be timid. I want you to say exactly what needs to be said, and don't be afraid to tell it to their face. He said, I have many people in this city. It's impossible to read this and not think about Elijah. When Elijah was afraid, he was running. He had just had this big victory. You would think he would be as bold as a lion, but he's hiding from Jezebel. And I'm laughing because he tells God, I'm the only one that's left. And now he had just met Obadiah with all these other prophets of the Lord. It kind of doesn't, what does he think of all those guys? He's like, they're not even following you. I'm the only one that's left. I don't know if that was an exaggeration, but this is what he says. God has not rejected his people for whom he knew. And he's quoted in Romans, so I'll read that. It's shorter. Do you not know that Scripture says to Elijah how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they've killed your prophets. They've demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. You could imagine Paul. Paul, I have devoted every single Sabbath since I've been here to these people. They are my countrymen. They are Jews. They are the people that we agree on the Bible. And yet every time I talk to them about their Messiah, they reject what I'm saying. I'm the only one here, right? You would feel alone. And God said to Elijah here, I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Don't feel like you're alone, because you're not. There are people that God has waiting in the wings. It doesn't say that 7,000 people came to encourage Elijah, but just knowing that God was in control and said, you're not alone. Now, I read this two ways when I see that Paul was told the reason to be courageous and the reason not to be afraid is, number one, I'm with you. I am with you. I am with you. Number two, I have people in this city that are mine. And you can read it two ways. One, to it that are already acknowledging me and will encourage you and join the effort. And then you have the other, it's like, no, I have people here. I have people that need to know me, so you better stay. You have a job to do, young man. I don't know how old he was, but I would imagine it would be that kind of a talk. You have a responsibility. Do not cower. Be courageous. So, verse 11, he stayed. He stayed there a year and 6 months teaching the Word of God. So it worked. Verse 12, but Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack while he was the proconsul. The Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if this were a matter of wrongdoing or a vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it's a matter of questions about words, about names, and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. So Paul was just about to give his defense. And Gallio, so it said he was just about to open your mouth. Gosh. I wish God did that to me more often. Just when I'm about to make my defense, he comes in and stops me. But that's what happened. Longnecker made a good point. He said if Gallio had judged this case, he would have set a precedent for all the other judges, which wouldn't have been good to promote the ministries. They were skillful in the use of the word law, because it wasn't against the law what he was doing, but it was against their law. But they were crafty in how they pitched this case. They made it sound to someone who really wasn't paying attention that what he was doing was actually illegal, but it wasn't. Isn't that interesting? I bet Paul had his defense ready. I got a ticket one time. There was a road, and it's still there now. It's called Bryan-Derry Road in Pinellas County. If you've ever been in Pinellas County, you may know it. It's a really big road now. It's got a on-ramp, off-ramp. It's a highway, essentially, now. And I was traveling at night, and this road was being constructed, and I saw a police officer turn at a red light that turned green, just go straight. And I was the other side, and I thought, oh, man, that road's done. All right. So on my way back that night home, I decided to take the shortcut. Instead of going an extra 5 miles out of the way, I'm going to take this new road. Well, if you go straight at the red light, what you're actually doing is going up the new off-ramp of this new highway. And so I'm driving along. I was dumb. I was a real stupid person. But, so I'm driving along at night, and this cop's coming from the other way. He whips around. And he gives me a ticket for driving against traffic, driving on an unconstructed roadway. It was like 4 things, right? It was like all the points you needed to lose your license in one stop. And he let me go home. Reckless driving. Anyway, I was so upset by it. And I felt, look, there was no cones, there was no do not go this way signs, there was a red light that turned green and you go straight. There was nothing there to tell me as a driver not to go down this road. Now, in hindsight, if I used my brain, I would have not done it. But in this Florida state, you really shouldn't have to use your brain. You should have signs that tell you what to do. So I went out and I took pictures. I was hiding in the bushes. I was taking pictures of cops doing the same thing, and I had my case ready. I literally had the trifold science project board. I had the whole thing ready to go to traffic court. And have you ever been to traffic court? It's very casual, right? People are wearing flip-flops. It's all in alphabetical order that you're called up. And the guy before me, my last name is a K. The guy before me was like a J. And he's in his three-piece suit. He's got this fat manual on the technical specifications of the radar gun. And he's quizzing the police officer that gave him a ticket. All these off-the-wall questions about his radar gun and how many hertz and all this. And he doesn't know. And so the judge finally, after a minute, he said, look, I really want you to have your day in court here, but this officer is not required to understand anything but point and shoot on this thing. So wrap it up. Well, while this guy was taking his, I have to tell you this. His ending statement was a poem that he wrote, saying that he wished he had been robbed that night. Oh, really, I feel like I was at the point of a radar gun by a green bandit hiding behind a trash can in an alley. That was the part that reminded me. So it was fun. It was funny. But in the interim, the cop that was there for me left. He was bored, right? It was taking forever. He was not going to hang around for this. So I came up ready to have my day in court too. And the judge said, it's your lucky day, because you'd probably lose your license if this got cleared, but the officer had problems with his wife and needed to leave. So before I was able to open my mouth, the whole case was stripped out before me and it was dismissed. But that's what happened with Paul, right? He was ready to make his defense. And he was right, but he didn't need to. It was better that God directed the heart of this proconsul. Not every Christian is so lucky. In March 2021, a group of Christian pro-life activists, including, I'll read you some names, Paul Vaughn, Ava Edel, Heather Adoni, and Calvin John Zastro, were involved in a protest in front of an abortion clinic. During the protest, they sang hymns and engaged in what they described as peaceful demonstrations. However, in the U.S. Department of Justice, this is 2021, charged them with using force and physical obstruction to injure, intimidate, and interfere with the employees of the clinic. And as a result, they are facing prison charges, with Paul Vaughn potentially facing up to 11 years in prison for sitting in front of an abortion clinic, worshiping, holding signs saying, please don't kill your baby. 11 years in America? Not everyone's so lucky. Verse 16, he drove them from the tribunal, the Jews. And they all seized Sosthenes, which is a name I have a hard time saying, the ruler of the synagogue, and they beat him in front of the tribunal, but Gallio paid no attention to any of this. And after this, Paul stayed many days longer. Now, I feel bad for this guy. I mean, can you imagine? They're just mad at the proconsul, so they said, yeah, we're going to beat up Sosthenes, and they start beating him up. And I don't know which is more sad, getting beat up by your people or the fact that nobody cares that you're getting beaten up. And that's exactly what was happening. But apparently Crispus trusted in Jesus. He was then replaced with this guy Sosthenes, who later himself became a Christian. We read in 1 Corinthians 1:1. Isn't that interesting? I have a 2-paragraph quote that I'll skip. He says, if anyone, it's a guy named Kretzmann, he said, if anyone is under the protection of the Lord, he is more secure than if all the armies of the world were summoned against him in defense. All right. Paul's wrapping up the final leg of the second missionary journey, and I'm wrapping up the final leg of this sermon. Paul returns to Antioch, and on his journey, verse 18, After this, Paul stayed many days longer and then took leave of the brothers and set sail to Syria, right? He's going toward home. With him was Priscilla and Aquila. Isn't that great? His new friendship, they now wanted to partner with him on the way home. It wasn't home for them. They didn't have a home, remember? So now they're journeying along. This married couple decided to go with them. At Cenchreae, he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow. It's almost certainly a Nazirite vow. I've always kind of been puzzled on this one. I was praying about it and I was reading about it, and something came to me this week, and I'm going to share what I felt. I didn't really even look to see if any commentators agree with me, so if I'm off base, hey, I'm just a person. But he had a Nazirite vow, and he's ending the vow. So the vow was basically no grapes, no wine, no cutting your hair. And at the end of the vow, you cut off all your hair and you offer the hair up to God. It's kind of a weird one. But I have to wonder, the type of immorality that was so prevalent in Corinth, and if you read 1 Corinthians, you see that, man, whatever happens in the culture does eventually leak into the church. Even as Christians, they struggled. They struggled with alcohol use. They struggled with sexual sin. There was even a guy sleeping with his mother or mother-in-law, and they were not worried about it. And I have to think, Paul came into this place, and why would he be under a Nazirite vow for this place? And my guess is, look, I know there's varying opinions on alcohol. I don't believe that Jesus created grape juice, right? But Paul went out of his way to make sure that there was no question about drinking in these Corinthian Christians. I think he knew that it would have been an extremely big problem for these people. And I think they would have had to come out of it. And so what better way to make it not even gray, make it black and white, that he's under a Nazirite vow. That way there's not even a charge, right? They charged Jesus with being a glutton and a drunkard, right? So that he must have had a glass of wine to do that. But we know that he wasn't sinful. Paul was saying, look, in this town, I'm going to put the gospel first. And if you read in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 in particular, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. And he carries on this thought for chapters. The passage that we always read when we do communion, he's actually correcting people getting drunk in the church with the communion wine. That's crazy. But it just shows you what state the church was. That it needed an extra definitive line here. And I think the thing that I really want to draw out there for Paul is that he was willing to do whatever it took to lead by example. And they came to Ephesus, and he left them there, them being Priscilla and Aquila, and he himself went into the synagogue, and he reasoned with the Jews. It's his old habits. And they asked him to stay for a longer period, but he declined. They were hungry for the word. So he took leave, and he said, I will return to you. What? What's it say? If God wills. And he set sail from Ephesus, and he landed in Caesarea, and he went up, and he greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. That's the end of his second missionary journey. After spending some time there, he departed and went from one place to the next through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. He was the missionary that couldn't stay home. Verse 22 and 23, he got home. It said that he was there for a while, and then he immediately left, and he went out again. I mean, what a guy. That's his heart. His heart was get the gospel out there. When he's home, he's feeling stuck, and I just need to get out. I love it. If the Lord wills, and that's where I want to close. He had learned this, hadn't he? 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 19, he said this, I will come to you soon if the Lord wills, and I will find out not the talk of these arrogant people, but their power. James 4, verse 15, instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. You see, he had learned this. He had had enough plans not go right to say, you know what, I'm going to make my plans, but really it's if the Lord wills, then it's going to happen. It also shows that he had confidence that God does get his will accomplished. If God wills it, you better believe it's going to happen. If God wants me in Corinth, you better believe I'm getting there. He'll spare my life from the proconsul. He will make sure I'm alive after being stoned in a previous city. So here's what I want to leave you with. The new friends that came into his life, the unknown. You're going to need friends for your journey in life. And there are going to be times where you're more alone than not. And during those times, be open to whatever God has for you. You have to be willing to meet people in order for that to happen. But also, you've got to remember that God is with you. Jesus is with you. He is for you. You are not alone. He has a purpose for you to be here. He had a purpose for Paul. He's got a purpose for you. And it's irrelevant how you feel. It does not matter if you feel weak, if you feel unsure. It doesn't matter if you're sick, if you're frail, if you're not gifted, if you don't know enough. God has a purpose for you and a calling for you. What a benefit to have old friends as well. We learn also how to handle opposition. You preach until you're innocent. Pay attention to the opportunities that come into your way, and remember that there are seasons in your life. Not everything you go through is permanent. Actually, nothing is. All the seasons that you're under trial will eventually end, and you'll be in a season of refreshing. And if you're discouraged, remember that the promise made to Paul from Jesus is also made to you. He said, "Do not be afraid, for I am with you." And he said, "I have many who are in this city," which means you're not alone. Lord, I ask that you would speak to your people today, and that they would realize that everything that you said to Paul is a promise that we can all stand on. Lord, I need to know that you're with me. There are times when I feel frail, and I'm trembling, and I feel ill-equipped, and I don't know what's going to happen. And the future looks so unsure. But all that really should do is cause me to draw closer to you and to be more confident in your power. And Lord, to remember that I'm not alone. That even if all my old friends have ever left me, and I feel that I will never make another new friend again, you're with me. And that's enough. Lord, help us to have the community mindset. Help us to see that we need to encourage each other. And sometimes that encouragement comes oh so naturally if we would just give in to friendships and not be afraid. We love you, Lord, and ask you to help us not to be afraid. In Jesus' name. I would encourage you